Welcome back. My name is Homai. Today we are going to explore types of motion between two voices. So to understand this, let's take a look at the types of motions that we have for just one voice. We really don't need a clef here. Let's say that we start off with this arbitrary note, okay? And this is its first position, this is starting point. And let's say that our second note is the same note. It doesn't change at all. This is what we call static motion. It can also be called stationary motion, any type of movement where it's not changing. Static, okay? It's not moving. So that's one way that it can move. Another thing that it can do is it could move by step. Okay, so that means it could either go up by step or down by step. All right, so this is stepwise motion. And the last thing it can do is it can leap by interval of a third or greater. And this is, again, up or down. So in this case, we have a leap. Now, there are other terms that some theorists use, but the terminology is not so important. It's understanding what they mean that is important. So a note can stay the same. It can move by step, up or down, or it can move by leap. Now, when you're taking a look at a pair of voices, well, now those pair of voices can move, in relation to each other. So let's take a look at examples here. I'll make the voices different colors. So let's take these two voices, the blue voice on top and the red voice on bottom. So both voices could be static. Both voices could be static. In this case, we have static motion or stationary motion between the voices. Nothing changes. Okay. What else can happen? One voice can be static while the other moves. The other changes. Okay, and it can change to any arbitrary note, doesn't really matter. Put an or here so that you know it's just going to one of those positions. So our top voice is static, or one of the voices is static. It could be the other way around, and one voice is moving. This is what we call oblique motion. Oblique motion. Static motion, oblique motion. Both of these types of motion, by the way, are almost always safe motions when we get to the rules of part writing. These are safe. And when I say almost always, I mean pretty much 100% of the time. We'd have to be very creative to find a scenario where these would be, would not work. Okay, what else can our voices do? Well, the voices could move in the same direction. So let's say the top voice and the bottom voice both move by a step. Okay? So the interval here is a fifth. The interval here is a fifth. Okay? So the interval has not changed because they've moved in the same direction by the same interval. This is what we call parallel motion. I'll do this in blacks too. This is parallel motion. Parallel motion. Sometimes parallel motion is good, sometimes it's not as good, and we're going to talk in another video about those scenarios. Let's say the voices move, but this time they move in the same direction but by different intervals. Okay? So in this case, this is a seventh here, but this here is an octave. So the top voice has moved by interval of a third, the lower voice has ascended by interval of a second. So they've moved in the same direction, but by different intervals. In this case, we are dealing with similar motion. Similar because they're moving in a similar way, same direction, but by different intervals. Keep in mind that these intervals are based on the numeric size only and not on the actual quality of interval. For example, you could have this voice move up by, say, a half step, and this one by, a step and a half, for example, and it won't matter. That's still parallel motion because they're both intervals of a fifth, even though this might have moved up by a minor second and this one might have moved up by an augmented second. That's irrelevant for now, okay? Irrelevant in terms of the type of motion we're dealing with. So you just care about the numeric value, numeric size of the interval alone. All right, so far, let's just review. We've talked about static motion, oblique motion, where one voice stays the same, the other changes. Parallel motion, they move in the same direction by the same interval. Similar motion, they move in the same direction but by different intervals. And then we also have a situation where maybe the voices move in opposite directions. So maybe this voice goes up and this voice goes down. We call this contrary motion. Contrary motion. So the voices move in contrary directions or opposing directions. One is ascending while the other is descending. These are your 5 basic types of motion when looking at two voices. We're going to look at a practice example now. And I'll just create one for you here real quick. So this time we'll give ourselves a clef. Not that it really matters. I'll do both my voices in black this time. And I'm just creating a nice little exercise here. Okay. Consider this as both voices. What we're going to do here is we're going to do two things. We're going to identify the interval in each of these cases, and we are also going to identify the type of motion. Okay? So we're going to identify our interval, and we're going to identify the type of motion. Used to approach it. So in this first one, there's been no motion since we only have one chord. Okay, we didn't arrive here from anywhere. This is our starting point, so there is no motion here, so we're not going to list that. But the interval is of a third. Then it goes to a fourth, another fourth, a sixth, a third, and then a unison. But let's now analyze the motions. Okay, so if we look at the motions, this voice stayed the same, this one changed. Therefore, this is oblique motion. We're just going to write an O for oblique. Okay, this moves up by a step, this moves up by a step. They are ascending in the same direction by the same interval, therefore this is parallel motion. Next case, the bottom voice stays the same. The top voice ascends by a third, therefore we have oblique motion again. In the next example here, the top voice descends, the bottom voice ascends, therefore we have contrary motion. I'll write a C for contrary. And in this last case here, the same thing happens. Top voice descends, bottom voice ascends, therefore also contrary motion. And let's say that we continue just to give ourselves another example. Let's say that they descend, the top voice goes down to here, and the lower voice drops to here, let's say, for example. This gives us the interval of a third. If we look at the motions here, the top voice dropped by a second, the lower voice dropped by a fourth. They move in the same direction but by different intervals. This is similar motion, and I'll just draw SIM for similar. And then let's say that now they stay the same. Okay, both of the same voices stay the same. This is static motion or stationary motion. I'll just put STA. And of course, the interval is still a third. Okay, so there's an example looking here at the types of motions that we have. Okay. And now let's take a quick look at what this looks like in a larger texture. So let's see if I can find one here. Yeah. All right, so let's take this hymn, for example. So this is a example from literature. And we'll just look at this very first part here just to get an idea of what we're dealing with here. So now we're not looking at two voices, we're looking at four voices. So when you're assessing motion, you have to compare all four voices against each other. Okay, so there's going to be 6 pairs of voices to check. So with voices, remember, we have soprano, we have alto, we have tenor, and we have bass. So we need to check the bass and the tenor together. We're going to have to check the tenor and the alto. We're going to have to check the alto and the soprano. We're also going to have to check the soprano and the bass. And we're also going to have to check the tenor and soprano, and also the alto and the bass. So those are the 4 checkpoints. So it seems like a lot. It does. But let me show you what you can do. Okay? So remember how I told you that static motion, okay, when you have one voice that stays the same, is really safe, or oblique motion is really safe? Basically, you're going to find any notes that are staying the same, and you're just going to know that you don't have to compare them. At least not the first one, right? So the alto stays the same. So the alto here is safe. He's safe. But we do need to check the other voices because everything else is changing here. Okay? So soprano to the tenor is a 6th. And then soprano to bass is an octave. I'm just doing the intervals here. And then and that's it. And then tenor, the bass is a 3rd. Okay? And basically that's what you're going to do. You're just going to go through and identify intervals. We'll be doing a separate video detailing the rules and how to find errors in 4-part writing. But this is just showing you how you'll actually be applying what we just talked about, comparing 2 voices in your actual analysis of 4-part writing. Hope this video was helpful. I'll see you in the next one.